Good day, everyone. My name is Susan Shaheen, and I am a professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. I also am the director of the California Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative on behalf of the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies, and I co-direct another center on transportation sustainability research at UC Berkeley. We're delighted to share with you today the unveiling of a new study that was jointly sponsored by the University of California ITS in concert with the TRB Executive Committee and with generous support from ClimateWorks. So before I introduce our illustrative panel, I wanted to share with you who we are. At the University of California ITS, we have a great group of faculty, researchers, and staff that are very dedicated to research and technical assistance in the areas of transportation engineering, planning, and policy. And we were established in 1947, so we are a very well-established group. And we are delighted to be able to sponsor this research in concert with the TRB Executive Committee. And the California Resilient and Innovative Mobility is a relatively new initiative that I'm directing on behalf of UCITS. And you can see our website there. So I'm really delighted to share with you our panelists who are all members of our steering committee. Our steering committee was actually larger than these individuals, but this is the group that we were able to bring in with us today. So we have in alphabetical order, Nathaniel Ford, who is the CEO of Jacksonville Transportation Authority, and I'm delighted to share that he's the incoming vice chair of the TRB Executive Committee. And Yasela Lort, principal for the Renaissance Planning Group and former transit director of Miami-Dade County. We also have Neil Peterson, executive director of the Transportation Research Board, and two of our directors of ITS campuses. We have Professor Daniel Sperling, who's with UC Davis and directs ITS Davis, and also Professor Brian Taylor, who is with UCLA and director of ITS UCLA. So what I wanted to do is share the full steering committee list with you. So all of these individuals signed on for about 6 months of very hard work, and we are very, very grateful to all of them. So I want to provide a brief presentation outline for today. I'll provide a bit of background on the motivation for this work, the methodology that we used, the final scenario worlds that were created. I'll also talk about timeframes because we focus a lot on that, and I'll provide detail in just a moment. Talk about the policy strategy vision, which is one of the big outcomes of this work, along with research recommendations and our proposed next steps and timeline. So as I promised, I want to just sort of set the stage. So this study and approach of using scenario planning was really motivated by this crisis of COVID and all of the impacts that it is having on society. And we have a special focus on both public transit and shared mobility in the context of this work. And this slide summarizes a lot of the impacts that many of us have seen that are greatly impacting both public transit and shared mobility. One of the things that our experts involved in this study were keen to note was that COVID-19 exposed a lot of underlying issues in how these types of services are provided to society. And as ridership declines and revenues decline, many of these providers have had to respond by reducing their services, their vehicle maintenance, and other types of operations to save costs. So as a result, those who depend on public transit and shared mobility services, particularly those without access to private automobiles, are experiencing further loss of their mobility. So these shifts are very important, and they're very much part of what our experts engaged in examining. And one of the things that I think is most important to understand about this approach is that it embraces the uncertainty in which all of us were facing this crisis. So our experts spent a lot of time throughout the course of the 6-month study developing a focal question. And one thing that's interesting is this focal question never changed over the course of the whole study. Many other things changed. The other thing that didn't change is the timeframes that we use to analyze our policy strategies as well as our research recommendations. But I'll take a moment to just read to you the focal question. What are sustainable and equitable short and longer term public transit and shared mobility policies for all communities under different scenarios in the context of the global pandemic and its recovery? And as you can see, the experts chose to focus on 3 timeframes for their examination of different scenarios. So to just briefly cover our timeframe and our methodological approach, we use scenario planning, but we also infused it with a Delphi approach. And so you can see here that there were several different types of committees. The steering committee, you're going to hear from many of them today. The scenario planning committee that met in July and August of 2020 in phase 2, our policy committee experts in phase 3, and then rounding out again with our steering committee. And you can see the number of sessions as well as the amount of time that those individuals dedicated to these deep ranging discussions. In this slide, I just highlight some of the goals and the objectives of these committees. And you can see that the steering committee was really responsible for kicking this off and setting the basic framework. The scenario planning experts were really responsible for developing the initial worlds and starting off with some preliminary policies, research needs, and possible signposts to track, like state of the economy. And then in phase 3, our policy experts really dug in with respect to understanding and refining those scenarios, but also really digging into the strategies for the policy response. And then finally, our steering committee reconvened, and they got the final word on what you're going to be seeing today. So our 36 experts were carefully selected. We generated a large list of experts, and the majority accepted the challenge and the time commitments associated with this. And you can see that they all do have some degree of transportation expertise, but not all of the experts were experts in public transit or in shared mobility. And they crossed a lot of sectors. And now I'd like to share with you all of the members of our scenario committee that we're very grateful to. And they don't fit on one page, as you can see here. And this is our policy committee. So let's dig in. So these are the final scenario worlds that were produced, and they are by time frame. And what you see here is the name of the world itself. So we actually named those, and those changed quite a bit throughout. You can see the optimism level. Some of the scenarios were less optimistic and some were more optimistic. And these are the driving factors that reflect the quadrants, which I'll be sharing with you in a moment, that were selected by the experts to focus on. In light of time constraints and our desire to move quickly through the exercise, we did not define all 4 quadrants or all 4 scenario worlds. And you can see as we move through the timeframes, they have actually different vectors defining them, and they also have very different names. Before I dig in, one of the things I wanted to tell you is that in wrapping up this study, many things have actually come to pass that the experts had uncertainty in understanding and addressing. One is the vaccine. At the time of these discussions, we did not know when we might see a vaccine. And at the time of all of these discussions, we did not know what would happen with the federal election. So it's very interesting to look at the results of this study in light of those 2 very important external factors. And you can see here in the first time frame within 12 months, you see a vector that reflects funding sources. Are we going to see new funding sources, for example, a new stimulus bill, or will there be no additional funding sources in the more pessimistic side of the vector? And will we see a continuation of depressed public transit demand, or will we restore services to pre-COVID levels? And you can see through the red circles the final scenarios that were explored and their names. In the next time frame of 1 to 3 years, you can see different vectors. So you see at the top, political will to fund and support change, and at the bottom, lack of political will to fund and support change. Again, this is very much reflecting not really understanding or the uncertainty of what was going to happen in the November election. We also have a slow economy vector and a robust economy vector. And you can see that our experts decided to hone in on different scenarios in this context. And they do favor the slow economic recovery world. So they were not entirely convinced that we would be facing a robust economic recovery. In 4 to 6 years, we have another set of vectors. We see new business models versus evolved business models. And I'm just going to take a moment to dig into that because you might say, well, what's the difference with that? And I think the evolved business models is that there are business models that are happening now that are quite innovative, and people are moving towards these public-private partnerships between the private sector and public transit agencies. So the experts wanted to recognize that this evolution in business models has already started, and that this timeframe could continue to reflect a more incremental form of evolved business models, in contrast to something that is much more disruptive in the area of new business models. And similarly, on this other vector, it's also kind of nuanced. All of the experts agreed that there was already a number of policy actions happening across the US that reflect sustainability, for example, electrification. So this side of the quadrant really reflects this continuation of incrementalism towards sustainability, and at this other side, very much focused on sustainability evolution. And you can see the names of the particular scenarios here. So now I really want to start getting into the outcomes or the results that are produced from these scenarios. And so when we were synthesizing all of these rich and deep discussions, what we came away with was, regardless of which world you were in, it felt like the experts were declaring a state of emergency. So if it was more pessimistic or more optimistic, it still had that flavor. And some of the key components of what it feels like to be in these worlds and developing strategies are some of these bullets I want to share with you. So a desire to integrate public health goals into transportation, refocusing attention on customer experience, restoring trust in the public transit system and its use, building these public-private partnerships and new funding structures, addressing barriers to regulatory and funding flexibility, and constructing coalitions and convening key organizations to combat the crisis. And again, the report is really robust. We're going to be sharing the policy brief with you today. And what I wanted to tell you is that a lot of these actions, right, are very much focused on what do we need to do immediately. Now we move into that second time frame of 1 to 3 years out from COVID-19. And this particular time frame, in terms of its policy theme, emphasizes systemic change. And some of the key characteristics of these policy recommendations are enacting new funding and pricing mechanisms, employing a customer-centric approach, creating new public transit business structures and models, engaging with employers throughout the recovery, for example, coordinating on telework and its possible impacts on public transit and shared mobility, integrating an environmental and a social equity lens, and also integrating transportation into non-transportation legislation. So taking a much more holistic approach towards where public transit fits in. And finally, our third time frame is 4 to 6 years. Build a mobility ecosystem around public transit, creating and connecting a shared mobility ecosystem that is fully complementary of public transit, deploying fair payment technologies, subsidies, and incentives, mobility on demand and mobility as a service platforms, and possibly integrating mobility, these incentives and subsidies and fair payment technologies all into a mobility wallet, emphasizing EV technology, electric vehicles, social equity-based programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and localized pollution, addressing labor concerns across the board and also with respect to AVs, and augmenting resources to retrain, retain, and restructure public transit and shared mobility workforce. Next, I want to give you an overview of the policy strategies. So across these deep and robust discussions that happened, we ended up synthesizing them into two big categorical areas. One is key public transit actions. And you can see here that there's 4 areas associated with that, and broader cross-cutting policies. So a recognition that transit is not alone in this recovery, that it fits into a much larger ecosystem of actors. And the 4 actions for public transit to take that have been recommended here include innovation and technology, planning and operations, workforce, and the customer focus. I'm not going to read all of the text underneath each of these, but we'll give you a moment to review those as I move forward into the second set of policy strategies. In terms of broader cross-cutting policies, there's a sense that immediate policy actions need to be taken, and they are not just actions for the public transit operators, including declaring a state of emergency and looking at many things that we can do immediately to take advantage of this moment, to seize this moment. They also include finance and subsidies, so really looking much more largely across the ecosystem and highlighting marginalized communities in that context. Aligning our societal objectives was a major theme of these discussions, including focusing on the role of the car and auto reduction, as well as looking at new metrics and measures. And then finally, a key theme that really came up throughout our discussions, and in particular in the policy committee, was the role of federal reauthorization as it comes to transportation funding. So now I'll move into research recommendations. In this presentation, I've grouped them into 2 key areas. Multimodal research needs, so looking at travel behavior resulting from work from home and telework policies, changes to transportation demand management and employer actions, racial and social equity issues should be examined, barriers to multimodal, cultural change in terms of our response and attitudes towards public transit and sharing of modes, the role of new data standards and metrics, behavioral changes that are happening in e-commerce and how that could impact both public transit and shared mobility, addressing regulatory inconsistencies across all governance levels and modes, and also examining opportunities to remove regulatory restrictions and barriers. Specific to public transit and shared mobility research needs, there's a long list here, including everything from scenario modeling to looking at the sliding scales of federal requirements associated with what was once the 80-20 split in federal funds to local funds, which pretty much doesn't exist anymore, but those federal requirements are still there. Funding mechanisms for public transit overall, social equity, incentives and subsidies, opportunities to build affordable housing in public transit-rich places, innovation in technology through policy partnerships, new business models, pilot programs, and evaluation. Also understanding the impacts of telework on public transit and shared mobility, and mechanisms for successful P3s between the public transit and private shared mobility operators. And you'll see when you gain access to the full report, these are outlined and detailed in much more detail for you. And so finally, what I wanted to do is wrap up with our proposed next steps, because we surely understand that you want to know, so after doing all of this work and coming up with recommendations and a policy vision, what would you recommend to go forward? And this was the hard work of the steering committee. And what we've come up with is 6 actions, also showing you across different types of timeframes. So convening stakeholders in a TRB and UCITS jointly sponsored workshop to develop strategic actions in partnership with both the Federal Transit Administration and the American Public Transit Association. I will defer to our experts to talk more about what they have in mind here, but lots of excitement around coordinating with many of the key stakeholders and alphabet soup in transportation that have had similar strategic exercises over the last months. Forming committees to develop strategic white papers focused on key policy actions, developing a supportive research agenda, you see the beginnings of that, developing an outreach and communications plan for briefings across our alphabet soups and also key legislative groups, coordinating with APTA in its role in seeking funding and regulatory reform on behalf of the public transit industry, including reauthorization, and seeking funding from appropriate sponsors. And that is already in the works. So I wanted to wrap up by directing you to the policy brief. The report is still in the final editing stage. We hope to share that with you shortly, but the policy brief, which is several pages long, encapsulates a lot of the key highlights that I've shared with you today. And before wrapping up, I wanted to thank my co-author, Stephen Wong, and also thank all of the experts, the funders, UCITS and SB1 funding, the TRB Executive Committee, ClimateWorks, and all of our team at UCITS, as well as UC Berkeley PhD students and my team that helped to pitch in to make all of this possible. It took a village to get this done, and I'm really excited to move to the panel presentations. All right, so thanks everyone. I wanted to welcome you to our panel discussion. What I am interested in doing is peppering our panel with a number of questions. And so what I thought I would do, Dan and Neil, you were the first I reached out to when I had this idea to cook up this project. And I will give you a lot of credit for being so enthusiastic and so supportive. So I thought I would direct this question to both of you. As a member of the steering committee, what are your thoughts and reactions to this scenario planning initiative, the policy options, research recommendations, and next steps? Neil, looks like you are muted.
All right, Dan, I might go first, and then I know you will react to what I have to say. So I've been in this business for over 40 years now. And certainly during those 40 years, I have not faced a period of more uncertainty than we have right now. And it's a real challenge in terms of trying to think from a planning perspective about the intermediate future, much less the long-term future. And I think we have to change our whole way of thinking from just trying to predict the future, a single point in the future, to planning really being about dealing with uncertainty. And the most effective way of doing that really is to think through, okay, what are the possible scenarios? What are the possible futures? And how do we then try to do planning that is robust enough that it helps us to be developing plans that will be good regardless of which of those futures that we move towards. So this exercise ended up I think, really framing very well the range of potential futures that we have over the next 5 years or so, and forcing us to think about how do we try to approach this under the different scenarios or under the different futures, and what are the policies that we need to be developing that will be robust enough to be dealing with any of those potential futures that we might be dealing with. I think we tend to think when we're doing planning too narrowly about a single future, and it limits us and therefore limits the actual plans that we develop. This exercise certainly demonstrated to me that we can come up with much sounder policies based upon thinking about it from a scenario perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Dan?
I would reaffirm what Neil is saying and take it a little further. This is a hugely important time in the history of transportation. And the crisis that we're seeing is so real. I mean, we are hearing story after story about many transit operators are likely to just disappear without a massive infusion of funds. And even then, we don't know. So this exercise was hugely valuable, I think, as a first step in identifying what are the issues and challenges, the uncertainty, starting to lay out some of the policies, but it was still pretty high level. And so, we need to be, so this has been really valuable for many of us that participated, and everyone else, is that it helps us to think through, where do we go from here? I've got the view that our transportation system has failed a huge part of our population, and we haven't really fully acknowledged it. And I think, maybe this is making lemonade out of lemon here, or taking advantage of a crisis. But this is a time for us to start thinking about, how do we serve this large, maybe 10 to 20% of our population is really mobility disadvantaged, physically or economically. And what are we going to do about it? And just bail. So yes, I know Nat on the line here, he needs money to keep his operation going, and many others, and that's important. But we should be looking at this as an opportunity to really serve a bigger portion of our population better and create a better transportation system.
Well, thank you both. So I'm going to move to another question, and I'm going to start with Yasela. So thinking longer term, what are the most critical actions that should be taken by public transit agencies? I know you have a lot of familiarity with public transit today to lay the foundation for the future of mobility. As we talked throughout this study, we have 3 key timeframes. But what are the most immediate critical actions that will set the stage for the longer term?
There are several. And Susan, before I answer your question, I guess I want to chime in a little bit on the previous question, because I think one of the most valuable things that came out of the study is setting forth the model to be doing this type of scenario analysis and looking towards the future. And that will help me answer the second question, which is the transit agencies all need to be looking very differently at their service models. And it's not an easy thing to change for anybody, but I think it's a particularly difficult thing for transit agencies because of the very constituencies that are involved in transit services. The normal way that a transit organization looks at, for example, service, is to look at their service twice a year, right? And then set their parameters first on that 6 months thing. I think one of the things to learn is that the future has to be a lot more agile. We need to be putting forth different models of operations that will work and are more likely to be able to be changeable and variable, with a lot more partners involved in it. For example, one of the things analyzing out here in Miami is that we've had a even in highway, a 16% shift downward in vehicular travel. And you would say, well, that's not that huge. Well, it is huge. But what went with it was a much larger shift in the time of travel. And the time of travel really alters transit services. So people are going to be traveling differently. They're going to be traveling at different times. They're going to be traveling to a different destination. And if transit agencies are really serious about maintaining choice riders, the whole future has to be looked at very differently. That's just a start.
Thanks so much. So, but I'm definitely going to ask this same question of Nat, but I think what I'm going to do is pop over to Brian Taylor, who's spent a great deal of time researching and examining the public transit industry. So Brian, same question for you. Thinking longer term, what are the most critical actions that public transit agencies can take today?
You know, one thing as I was listening to the other panelists and looking at the various scenarios is that transit has often been criticized for being, you know, a bit too resistant to change and sort of slow to adapt. I think if we look back at this last year, it's been a remarkable example of having to pivot almost without knowing how to keep the operators safe, how to keep the passengers safe, how to reallocate service, which has dramatically changed. We're doing some nationwide research right now, looking at shifts in demand, and many operators had dramatic shifts where some neighborhoods ridership demand didn't change very much. Others in the central business districts it plummeted, and the remarkable redeployment of service has been quite impressive. That's all occurred with, for many operators, sort of a critical bailout from the CARES Act, which allowed them to kind of focus on these sorts of issues. And transit is sort of unusual compared to many other government services because it not only depends on revenues like a school district does or a fire department, where taxes are collected one year and allocated the next. It also collects money out of the fare box, and that money was lost immediately. So they had immediate losses in revenue. And they're now looking at many of those other subsidy sources being more uncertain over the future. And if they had to cope to enormous uncertainty in this past year, the next year I think is facing enormous uncertainty on the financial front. I mean, I'm sure everyone is watching Senate negotiations right now on a daily basis as to what's happening there. But you know, the thing that I've done over the years looking at transit finance is that, you know, if you really know the finances of one transit agency, you know the finances of one transit agency. I mean, the subsidy sources that they get vary so much around the country, even from region to region within a state. And right now we are looking at a considerable uncertainty, to go back to Neil's opening comment. And to do financial planning, I think, is the most critical issue they're going to do, to look at alternative futures where we have to know what that low revenue, mid revenue, and you know, best case revenue future is, and try to think about how to plan for that. And that's not easy to do when you have big workforces, you have a lot of capital. Their big challenge, I think, is really going to be thinking about those various financial scenarios for the future. And you know, we talked about that in the scenarios that I listened to. There is arguments that the economic recovery, once it comes, will be very rapid because there weren't underlying economic problems that forced the recession. Others that it could delay things. And this is just an unprecedented time of uncertainty. And doing that, I think financial planning in the context of that uncertainty is going to be the most critical challenge for transit systems moving forward.
Yeah, and to further complicate that, Brian, right, transit operations are not one size fits all. So Nathaniel, what are your thoughts and reactions to Yasela and Brian, and to this question about your job as a transit CEO?
Well, first, let me start off by thanking you, Susan, for leading this effort. I mean, your passion clearly shows, and I think everyone in our industry appreciates the work you've done here, as well as all of my colleagues who served on the steering committee and the experts that participated. I think right now, you know, if I were to think of what we should immediately be doing, is continuing and I'm following up on what Brian said in terms of our industry, I think has responded pretty well in terms of this pandemic with everything we had to do from protecting our operators, making sure they were safe, along with our customers that frankly, if they were riding our systems, they didn't have a choice to work from home. And they really were the heroes and kind of the undergirding of what needed to be done in our community. So, I mean, hats off to all of my peers around the country for responding the way we have. I think there's an opportunity for us to expand our audience, so to speak, in terms of our relevance in public transportation to the health, economically to our communities, health-wise in our communities, just in terms of just the services we provide that supports people, whether they know they are familiar with public transportation or not. And one of the examples of this that I see right in front of us right now is the distribution or the accessibility to getting vaccinated. And so when I start looking at public transportation's role as it relates to this pandemic and recovery of this pandemic, right in front of us is a major logistics challenge, which is how do the hundreds of millions of US citizens get access to this vaccine? And in some cases, if I look at my community here in Jacksonville, we are well aware of those pockets where there are transportation deserts. How are we going to ensure that those citizens are able to get access to vaccines, or vaccines get access to those citizens? And so we've begun the process literally a month ago to start working on what that vaccine distribution logistics program needs to look like for our community. We need to make sure that there's equity in terms of that distribution, and public transportation has always had a long-standing role in terms of providing social equity in our communities. And I see this as an opportunity for our industry to lean in to deal with what may not be so plainly obvious a challenge to our greater community. And I think actually getting that greater community, those people who support our systems through sales tax, gas tax, numerous different type of funding models, for them to see the value of public transportation, whether they ride our system on a daily basis or not. And so I see us as a vital link to this healthcare crisis. I also see in front of us right now is clearly the need to reinvent ourselves, and the work that TRB has done, that APTA has done, and I think you called it, Susan, the alphabet soup. There is a lot of great information and ideas and strategies in all of this activity and all of this work. And we're working on reinventing ourselves through our strategic plan, reimagining the JTA and what we do going into the future, because it is a new normal, but the planning and the actual work needs to be done immediately for our transit agencies to be successful in the future. And clearly a great deal of courage, and I'm feeling brave going into this unknown period and doing some things that are clearly that are out of the box, and what we're not used to is going to be a necessity. And so that's what I see in front of us right now, leaning into helping this vaccine get widely distributed and providing information and access, reinventing ourselves through strategic plans that if you started that planning in 2019, it's obsolete. And we got to start from scratch, and you need to be taking that activity underway right now.
Susan, I would like to pick up on
Absolutely.
both Brian and Nat just made. And this certainly came through as we were going through the exercise. An awful lot of the attention from a financial perspective has been on, is Congress going to provide the money to help bail out transit agencies? And the doomsday scenario was, if they don't do it, we're going to have drastic cuts in service. But let's remember that particularly for operating costs, the vast majority of operating costs don't come from the federal government. They come from local sources, not even from fare box revenues. Right. And it looks like Congress is not going to be providing money for state and local governments. So this point that Nat in particular was making about making the case about the value and importance of transit to the community is especially important now in terms of ensuring that we are getting the funding that we need at the state and local level for transit agencies.
Any other takers on this one?
Susan, Isela here.
Mhm.
Just one, I guess I'd like Nat to comment on this because he has been extraordinarily brave and responsive in JTA's reformulation of how they provide their services. But I suspect that a lot of that was also the freedom that an emergency gave you. You know, when
Right.
you have an emergency, then you can jump in and try things that you've always wanted to try, but it's harder in classical times. So then now, how do you continue that spirit of emergency and innovation going towards the future?
You know, Yelsa, I think it's the passion of the team in terms of their understanding of the role we have in our community. And while some people who don't use our system on a daily basis may not fully understand that, I think the passion, the creativity, the business mindedness that you must have is critical to that success. And so, you know, what other industry or business would watch the slow decline that we've had in terms of transit ridership prior to COVID and not take some very creative, drastic or out of the box strategies to try and reverse that trend. And so I think when COVID-19 hit at least my agency, we took it on as a challenge to not just find ways to run public transit, but to find ways that we can lean in and help deal with the pandemic and use the resources that weren't necessarily our transit buses and our Skyway, but what are the resources we have in terms of business intelligence? What are the resources we have in terms of technology that we were working, you know, the autonomous vehicle technology we were working on? And we went and sought out and knocked on doors to say, hey, look, we can offer this solution or we could help support this particular activity. And it has brought us a great deal of more, how would I say, support from our business community, from elected officials that we're seen as an asset far beyond whether you just ride our buses or not. And I think that messaging is critical. And I have to be careful because very early on I was saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste. But I think in the seriousness of this pandemic and the number of lives that are lost, it's appropriate not to phrase it that way, but it is important that we do look at how this crisis can be, I guess, the spark or the fire for us to leverage in terms of our relationships with our unions, the relationships with our business community and funders, and also the support we receive from elected officials who, again, may not recognize the importance of public transportation in this community.
Can I build on?
You got something, Dan? Okay,
Yeah,
go.
I want to. So I think we're moving well into the discussion here. So I want to build on, you know, this theme of innovation. You know, Nat needs to be really highly commended for the innovations they've done in Jacksonville. You know, and I do want to acknowledge, and you know, transit operators have been starved for a long time, and to the point they have declined. And the reality is they're only serving about 2% of our travel in this country.
Right.
And the needs and the demands are far greater than that, even before you get to the idea of transit being an economical way of moving people in dense areas, but just in terms of serving people that are disadvantaged. And so how do we go, you know, if we increase the 2% by, you know, 50%, that's still way far short of what can be and should be happening. And so the idea, I think, that we need some of those innovations that Nat was just starting to talk about, I think are the really important ones to focus on. It was the motivation for this whole exercise, is that how do we get transit to not only survive, not even thrive, but greatly expand its benefits and what it offers to, you know, many people and many of our travelers that especially that are disadvantaged in some way. And so I think that one of the themes that was in our exercise that I really want to highlight is, how do you get these transit operators to work more with these other kinds of mobility services? because there's no way that conventional transit systems are going to get up, serve 5 or 10 or 15% or 30% of our travelers. And that's when it comes down to, we've got to really get creative. And that's connecting up with these different kinds of micro mobility services, the dockless bikes, the dockless scooters, that can be first and last mile. It's connecting up better with the micro transit services like Via, who's starting to come into existence, but, greatly expanding that, working with, the Lyft and Uber type companies. And I think the way we do that, so this is kind of where I've been coming at for a while now, is focus on these partnerships in a way that is targeted at low income travelers and physically limited travelers. And, that's maybe a way to break this logjam on the finance side, because right now, a lot of the money cannot be used to support any kind of private services. I happen to think that's a big mistake, because otherwise we'll never build these partnerships.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I'm curious what other panelists think about these creative and key strategies. What other types of approaches should we be taking? Anybody can take a stab.
I'll jump in at this point. There are a lot of experiments going on in metropolitan areas all across the country on creative ways of trying to both address the issue of how do we provide access to those who need it but don't get it through traditional transit services, as well as how do we provide more cost-effective service, especially during off-peak periods, so that money can be saved and therefore put back into providing better service when it is actually needed. So I was actually on a panel earlier this week with a representative from the Tampa St. Petersburg system in Florida. And they've really done some, I think, very, very good work in terms of providing alternative service to areas that are not well served by existing traditional transit service. And maybe the subsidies are higher per trip, but when you look at it in terms of what the cost would be of providing traditional buses, or in a lot of instances, the buses can't even access the particular areas, you're starting to address these issues of getting service to those who need it the most. And equity has to become one of the principal metrics that we use in terms of decisions that are made on where service is going to be provided.
I'd like to pick up on that last point that Neil made, if I could. I think that if you look at research on when voters support public transit, it is often around issues of congestion relief or environmental benefits, that there's a strong support for that. And in many ways, transit operators have sort of almost had this secret, and the secret is that they're providing incredibly important social service transportation for people who have limited mobility, and that role, those riders are disproportionately low income. They're more likely immigrants. They're more likely people of color. They're people who are in more economically precarious situations, and the ability to get those folks to school, to work, to medical care is critical. I think that this year, with both the pandemic and the sort of racial justice uprisings that have occurred around the country, have really cast that role for transit in sharp relief. And I'm hopeful moving forward that incredibly important role for public transit, provide mobility for people without, is not something that is not a political winner, but is really something that will be upfront as a critical thing that public transit does. And it should be about environmental sustainability and a variety of other issues. But I don't think that, and I'm hoping that incredibly important role, which is really what public transit systems around the country are doing right now today, more than almost any period in recent history, is something to be sort of proud of, and to see that this is an enormous priority for these systems, and that if there are drastic service cuts, it's going to be the most vulnerable who are going to pay the biggest price along, as it is in so many other dimensions. So I'm hopeful that one thing that will come out of this is that transit will be seen as incredibly critical in providing that key source of mobility. And that's not the only thing that it can or should do, but that is all by itself a reason to support transit in a big way. So, as we go forward, I think that, and we think about ridership recovery, it's not only to get choice riders back, but it's also to make sure that those people who are sometimes referred to as transit dependents are provided the service they need to thrive in life. And I think that there may be a positive movement in that direction, and more of a focus on saying providing quality service into the neighborhoods where it's most needed is really should be a priority moving forward.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I think we have time for at least one more question from me before we go to the audience questions. What regulatory and institutional barriers are preventing public transit and shared mobility from scaling, from complementing one another, from getting to this vision of a transportation ecosystem? What do we need to fix?
Money, money, money. And the problem, okay, so there's others that are more expert at this, but I have to say, this is like a labyrinth of transportation that, it's so obscure, esoteric, that almost no one outside of the inner circle understands how transportation finance goes. But the one thing we've come to learn is that all these pilot projects that we've been hearing about, all this innovation, there has been a lot of transit operators trying out a lot of things, but almost all of them are essentially temporary because they're just using ad hoc sources of funds. They don't have a permanent revenue stream to support it. And part of it is, at least I think the federal government at least does not allow money, transportation money, to be used for private operators. And probably others have, I'd be interested in others following up on that idea, but somehow we need to figure out how to support these public-private partnerships, because that's the only way we're going to get, beyond 2 or 3% of mode share.
Susan, I'd like to weigh in on that. I think when we look at that, obviously funding is critical, but the funding that we do receive, I think flexibility in that funding to be able to use it for modes that are not typically called public transportation or public transit. And I think many of you are aware of my perspective that, public transportation starts with a sidewalk. It also is bikes, it's scooters, and in some cases it's automobiles that then transfer through a park and ride to transit. And so we're, as the JTA, we're responsible for road building and bridge building as well as public transit. And quite often we see where, we have to draw a bright line even inside the JTA in terms of how we fund a project and what buckets of money can go towards a project that has multiple modes actually incorporated in it. And so I would just say the flexibility going forward as it relates to what funding we receive from the federal government and having that flexibility related to that. I also would say flexibility in terms of how we measure what is public transportation ridership. Quite often some of the work that we're doing here and some of the projects we're doing here, it does not fully capture the actual benefit to our community and the benefit to that rider. And so the measurement that we currently have in terms of pure riders in each seat of a bus or train may not really reflect the type of rider and the impact on that rider in terms of the benefit for the community that they come out of, as it relates to a benefit of healthcare, a benefit of employment, a benefit of educational advancement. So I would look at a couple of things. One, clearly flexibility in terms of that funding that we do receive that allows us to walk into different shared mobilities or single person modes that we need to encourage, because they then support public transit because that person is able to use it for their first and last mile. And then also the point as it relates to just how we measure ridership going into the future, I think is critical from just a value proposition in terms of the services we provide. Not all passengers are created equal. And as we'll see with this vaccination situation, there are some folks that clearly, if it weren't for public transportation, there will be healthcare outcomes that impact all of us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for moving into this issue of metrics, because this was something that was emphasized throughout our discussions, that maybe we're just focusing on measuring the wrong things. And by doing so, we're not highlighting as much the critical value and role that public transit and shared mobility systems can provide to
That's
society.
exactly why I brought it up, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, you know what, I'd like to take moderator privilege. And actually, I said, maybe we'll finish up on this question. But I think given that I've got such luminaries in transportation research and the Transportation Research Board here, what are the most important research questions we should be examining to help guide and shape the future of mobility as we recover from this crisis? Thoughts from the researchers or TRB, Neil?
I can go, I guess, just to get things started. You shared the questions ahead of time, so I have to admit I thought a little bit about this. I think that we started. There has been research on transit system engagements with different sorts of mobility providers, different contracting arrangements. I think that that there may be an acceleration of that sort of research as we move forward to think about the various ways that that those kinds of engagements can occur and occur productively. I think the degree to which those services can reach isolated and disadvantaged populations, especially in hard to serve areas with traditional fixed route transit and outlying areas, will be really important going forward. One of the things that's come up leading up to the pandemic was the issue of curb and lane management, especially in big cities. And now in many cities here in Southern California, much parking has been taken up with spaces for restaurants and other kinds of businesses to be outdoors. Those are now closed because of the severity of the pandemic. But it raises a question about how much of street space we want to devote to people storing their private property, that is their cars, versus the ability to move transit through congested areas more effectively, to create space for micromobility, to create space for bicycles, a variety of other issues. That had sort of been on the cusp, and I think now that there's been much more of a aggressive staking out of territory in streets, that's likely to accelerate as well. And I think that the big issue leading with drifting transit ridership leading up to the 2010s is that many of the causes of that, and we've done research that here in the University of California, it's been Georgia Tech, a variety of others, that much of those things were not things that are direct to transit agencies, that increasing auto access, the rise of ride hail, high housing prices in many metropolitan areas, pushing people out into less transit friendly areas. The policies to address those are not things that transit operators control necessarily, but the degree to which we address those issues have a huge effect on the viability of transit moving forward. And so I think that research on thinking about those roles to make transit sort of a more viable enterprise in a variety of environments is going to be more on the fore as we come out of the pandemic than before.
So I'll pick up, Brian really covered many of the points that I would have been trying to answer your question, but I think there's going to be some fundamental changes in travel demand that will be taking place as we come out of the pandemic. And we really need to understand what those fundamental changes are and then how they relate to provision of services and how service can be most effectively provided. So, most employers now are talking about going to some version of telework, not full-time telework, but what impact is that going to be having on the provision of services, and how can those services be best provided? I was going to pick up also on the last question that you asked. And FTA, to their credit, really is trying to challenge us to be thinking much more about the complete trip, from when someone actually steps out of their house to they get to the point where they're going as well, rather than thinking about a trip, for example, just on the transit bus itself or the transit vehicle itself. But they haven't changed their funding policies to really be supportive of that complete trip focus. I think our research needs to be more focused on complete trips and what we need to be doing to be trying to provide for complete trips, as opposed to thinking about the trips on particular modes themselves, which tends to be how we have focused our research in the past.
Neil, to follow up on that, and I think part of that is a major governance challenge. And I think, at the local level, how we're organized around transportation in our communities, unfortunately, for decades, has lent itself to really silos as it relates to who controls parking, who's in charge of streets management, who's in charge of public transportation, state roads that then cross through some of our communities. So you have a very disjointed experience as a customer, and I think, or as a citizen. And I think one of the activities that I think all of us could benefit from is, what is the optimal governance strategy that leverages better coordination for a citizen? Let's think about it from their perspective, but not the way that we're organized. But what is the best governance structure that enhances that citizens' transportation or citizens' mobility? And moreover, what are some of the efficiencies of that? Because from my time in San Francisco and my time here in Jacksonville, I clearly see the efficiencies of the projects that we implement with the limited amount of funding we receive at a local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. With the limited amount of funding, I dare say that when we do a road project, that we think through, okay, the bike lane, we think through the pedestrian access and pedestrian safety at intersections, we think through bus stop locations and what those stops need to look like in terms of that complete streets perspective. And it's one thing to talk about complete streets, but you've got to have the pure kind of governance and organizational structure for that to be effective. And I think I would make an argument that there is a financial or economic formula that shows the optimization of that type of governance, as well as the effectiveness in terms of services to our communities. Right now, it's so siloed in some ways that even the best efforts and the best hearts and minds it's difficult to pull all of that together cohesively.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Nat, and thank you to all of our panelists. I wanted to just take a few minutes that remains. You probably can see there's been a sea of questions coming in. And so we will not be able to address them all live, and we will do our best to respond and answer to them and get back to you all with responses. But I think what we'll do is we'll take a few of these questions. So one that I'm going to pick out of the group, I'm not going in sequential order, that stands out to me because there was so much discussion about communicating to the public, communicating to others outside of the transportation industry. I'm going to turn to this question. Is there a framework or any type of framework for communicating between public transit organizations and large-scale employers about commuting behaviors and how they may change in the near future? Or is that something that will need to be developed? Is there something like that that already exists, or is that something we need to work on? Nat, are you familiar with anything like that? Are you guys thinking about this at APTA or?
Interestingly enough, as we have gone through this examination of what's, ridership and what we're going to do going into the future, one of the things that we came across is the heavily subsidized parking in downtowns by businesses. And, when we sought to reach out to a lot of the downtown companies here in Jacksonville, we found that, yes, they're supportive of public transportation. They like the idea of public transportation, but on the flip side of it, the subsidy for parking is so great and so beneficial to their employees that it really runs counter to what we're trying to do. So I think there is a great deal of work that needs to be done as it relates to explaining to them, that subsidy that they provide to cover that parking spot versus the taxes that everyone pays to support the public transportation system. It's kind of working at odds with each other. And so I think there's a great deal of work that needs to be done with that. I know some of my colleagues around the country have made great strides in that. I think of my colleague in Ohio, that she's been able to work out free transportation in her community, and it's being subsidized, at least in the downtown core, subsidized by the businesses. And so I really got to look at how she pulled that off and what was the value proposition that was presented to those private corporations. So I think there's more work to be done in that regard.
So Susan, there's also been, particularly in suburban employment centers, a lot of instances in which employers actually will provide private bus service, whether it's to a rail system or other destinations that their employees are going to. And there are several examples around the country where the public transit agencies working together in partnership with those private employers, especially in suburban areas, to be getting that private transit service provided by the employers for their employees.
Susan Isela here. There have been numerous efforts along this line, some of them through commuter assistance programs and others. But I guess where we are right now is because of changing travel patterns in either the impact of telework, the impact of telemedicine, the impact of teleshop. All these things together are really going to require an awful lot and closer communications with the employers as they shift the methods and the way that their employees are going to be reaching them. So we're all going to have to work in figuring out the best method for this, and we're going to have to learn from other industries that have a lot of experience in talking directly to the consumer and to industries.
Yeah, there was so much emphasis on that throughout this exercise. That's why I really wanted to highlight this question. So thanks for your responses to that. There's another question that I think we talked as experts across these 6 months about this quite a bit, but I'll pose it to all of you because I think it's a really tough question, is how should regions approach trade-offs between transit priorities and investments, particularly in a very financially constrained environment? What new or different criteria and data or information should regions use to inform these decisions?
Let me start with a little backup on this, and that is going back to your research question. We do have all of these experiments and pilot projects going on, and almost no one is evaluating them. We're not learning lessons that would inform the question you just asked, Susan, and many of the others. We talk about a customer-centric, way of thinking about it, but, and we have some experience on it. And, as researchers, there's no data. And, a lot of the ones that run it, they didn't have the money to support evaluation, or they didn't want to know what the answer would be, if they failed, because that, of course, looks bad in the public arena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's been comments about the need for better data if we are going to get serious about this.
So it's hard to even do metrics, when we really are not learning empirically from what's going on.
Yeah, there's so much to be learned. This exercise, I think, gave us a lot of insights into how systemic this is, as a challenge, and how much work we all have together that we have to work on. One of the things that I was really struck by in this exercise was how much participants talked about the need to just have a space like this, to have this conversation in which we weren't working on a specific pilot or data agreement or something like that, but that we could just have an open discussion about the role of public transit and how shared mobility might fit in, and that we really need to continue that moving forward. There's also a comment in our Q&A box about the value of this exercise itself, and if such a methodological approach could benefit states and MPOs and others at a transit agency level. Does anyone care to comment on that?
I think
Yeah, and how,
Go ahead,
I'm sorry,
Isla.
Neil.
No,
And
go
how
ahead.
it could be replicated in communities all over this this nation.
Yeah,
I think we're starting to see particularly more and more MPOs starting to use a scenario approach in terms of their planning, starting to recognize the uncertainties that they're facing. I mean, Nat or Isela may know better than me in terms of to what extent it's actually being used by public transit agencies. But we're also starting to see more development of methodologies associated with dealing with this uncertainty. So it's not just, think through what the potential scenarios are and think through what the issues are associated with them, but actual numerical methodological approaches associated with it as well. There's been a lot of work done in the military on this as they've thought through scenarios that we can be learning from as well. We just had a symposium that we held for Federal Highway Administration, in which we had a representative from RAND come in and talk about this type of approach being used. And I think there's tremendous potential for expanding this from the type of exercise we had to an individual metropolitan area or an individual transit agency.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is that I think that there's tremendous potential, especially if it goes cross-sector. So, for example, along the coasts and including in California cities, there's a huge affordable housing crisis, and the market demand is for lots of higher density housing in already sort of built up affluent areas where neighbors are opposed and very well organized to oppose it. If left to its own devices, the market would be creating a lot more very transit friendly environments. And we have an ironic situation where much of the sort of land use debates right now are trying to limit increases in densities that would both address our affordability problem and would create more transit friendly environments where transit can function much more effectively than in the sprawling low density environments where buses are often asked to ply and are at a disadvantage relative to getting around in cars.
Yeah, thanks for threading that needle, Brian, between affordable housing and in land use densification and public transit. So we have reached the time where we need to wrap up. There's been so much interaction in the chat box and on Q&A. We're going to do our best to get back to you. We are marching forward, both UCITS and the TRB Executive Committee, to continue these discussions and deep thinking. We're in the process of raising funds to move forward with all of these things. And I think this active exchange in the Q&A and in the chat box, I think really reveals how important this type of discussion and strategic exercise can advance us in developing a more holistic transportation and sustainable and equitable system for the future. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank all of the 36 experts that supported this work, along with our UC ITS teams and students at at UC Berkeley. And with that, I will conclude this webinar, and we look forward to sharing the final report with you and engaging with you more as we move into next steps. Thank you.
And we all want to thank
And-
our fearless leader, Susan.
Yes,
Kudos
thank you,
to
Susan.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hats off to
Great
Susan.
job.
Thank you. All right. Happy holidays, all.